An excellent question, said Inspector Priestley, and one that I have certainly been wrestling with. Lord Hastings, would you care to explain your actions? Lord Hastings coughed. I said, I hardly think I need to explain myself. Could you simply take my word that what I did had nothing to do with the murder? Unfortunately not, said the inspector. Oh, come on, Daddy, don't be an idiot, said Daisy. Just tell us. We know that you do some terribly stupid things. We're all quite used to it. Poor Lord Hastings, I thought. Sometimes I do think that Daisy is terribly cruel to her parents. A red flush spread across Lord Hastings' plump cheeks. He said again, if you must know, I tipped salt into Mr. Curtis's cup before I handed it to him. Chapman put his hands over his eyes. George, whatever were you thinking? Cried Lady Hastings. Daddy! Shrieked Daisy. It seemed quite funny to me at the time, said Lord Hastings, trying to look dignified. Of course, I see in retrospect that it might not have been quite the thing to do, but there are some things that a man simply can't take lying down, and someone coming into his house and stealing his wife is one of them. Good heavens, George, nobody stole me, snapped Lady Hastings. I'm not a rug or a vase. I can do what I like. I know, said Lord Hastings. I do try to understand, but it was rather difficult this time. I hope you'll forgive me. Lady Hastings sniffed. But, Daddy, if that was it, you've had everyone thinking you were guilty of murder. Look, Chapman's crying, poor thing. I certainly am not, Chapman said quickly, wiping the wet off his face. Do forgive me, I was yawning. I must be tired. Said Lord Hastings again. Yes, well, I apologise. Daisy rolled her eyes. Anyway, she said. Then Mr. Curtis drank the poison tea and expired. Stephen must have felt pleased, but then he realised that he'd forgotten something. The teacup was still in the dining room, full of arsenic, and if the police were called in, they'd find it at once, with his fingerprints on it. The watch was there also, and of course he wanted that too, as it was his by rights. He waited until the house had gone quiet, pinched the keys from the umbrella stand, and then went into the dining room to clear up the cup and steal Mr. Curtis's watch. Quite by mistake, we disturbed him while he was still in the room. I looked over at Stephen and shuddered. When we ran out, he must have stuffed the cup and watch into his dressing-gown pocket, locked the door again, put the keys back in the stand and gone upstairs. Then all he had to do was slip into the kitchens the next day while Mrs. D and Hetty were out of the room and put the cup back with the washing up. They noticed it, which wasn't part of the plan, but of course they had no idea who had put it there, and we didn't either. When Mummy was pushed, we thought we could rule Stephen out. He had no motive that we could see, and he was up on the top floor. We heard him come thumping down after she fell, and Uncle Felix raised the alarm. But of course he must have crept down the servants' stairs, shoved Mummy, dashed back up again, and then come down by the front stairs, innocent as anything. He must have thought that when she talked to the police, she would tell them something that might incriminate him. But how could you? She asked, turning suddenly on Stephen. Mr. Curtis really was a criminal, but Mummy never did anything to you. She didn't deserve to be almost murdered. Stephen shook his head. He said, I thought Lady Hastings was Miss Alston. She'd spoken to me earlier that day. She threatened me, and I realised that she suspected me. It was so dark at the top of the stairs, and she was standing with her back to me. I would never have pushed Lady Hastings if I'd known. Lady Hastings looked outraged, and I thought slightly put out. Just like Daisy, she likes to be the reason for everything. Really, I don't believe that for a moment. You wanted to murder me, she said, and after I invited you into my home. Never mind all that, said Uncle Felix smoothly. I think we've heard enough, Inspector. Don't you agree? A look passed between them, and Miss Alston caught the tail of it. She straightened her blouse, cleared her throat, and said, Indeed. Of course, I realised, Miss Alston really did know Uncle Felix. If she was a policewoman and Uncle Felix was whatever he was, they must both be on the side of the law, with Inspector Priestley. That was why Uncle Felix had not wanted to call in the police. He knew that they were already there. Now they must both be desperate to cover up the truth of who Miss Alston was and what she was doing in the house. Daisy narrowed her eyes, glaring at the two of them, and Inspector Priestley, and for a moment I thought she was going to say something. For once, though, she seemed to decide that it was best to stay quiet. I was glad. And that's really it, you see, she went on, turning to the inspector. That's how Stephen did both crimes. The evidence is all there, the page, the book and the watch. So do you believe us? Do you? You must. It all makes sense. Inspector Priestley's forehead was the wrinkliest I had ever seen it. He said, I do, as a matter of fact. Mr. Bampton, do you have anything to say for yourself? Stephen opened his mouth emptily. His voice, when it came out, was empty too, all hollow. I am sorry, he whispered. I'm sorry about Lady Hastings. I didn't mean to hurt her, and I would never have hurt anyone else. I suddenly knew exactly what I wanted to say to him. That's not true, I said. You would have let Daisy's father be punished for what you did. And me. You made me think you were a good person. How could you? I thought I was, said Stephen miserably. I think that was the first true thing he had said to me all weekend. Chapter 8. After that, Beanie's father rushed Beanie, weeping, and Kitty, eyes all goggly with shock and excitement, out of the door. He started the car, face thunderous, as Chapman loaded the cases into the boot. Daisy pulled us all into a huddle for one more hasty conversation. You mayn't say anything, she muttered to Kitty and Beanie. Not anything about the Detective Society or its part in this. Deadly secret, remember? We swore. But, Kitty began, Kitty Freebody, I have told you before that I know medieval tortures, and I will use all of them on you if you so much as breathe a word of any of this. This is important. Oh, don't, cried Beanie. We won't. You know we won't. You wouldn't, said Daisy, but Kitty might. She talks. All right, snapped Kitty. I won't. I don't ever even want to think about it, said Beanie. Poor Mr. Curtis, poor Stephen. Murder is awful. Thank you, Beanie, said Daisy, rolling her eyes. So, Kitty, you won't talk. If you don't, you can stay members of the Detective Society. Minor members, of course, but it's an honour, see? I told you I'll stay, Mum, but I want a badge. If there are ever badges, said Daisy grandly, as Beanie's father ground the engine and glared at us, you may have one. Beanie and Kitty piled into the car. It crunched wetly down the drive, and when they were gone, it made me feel homesick again, though I was still not sure for where, though I did know that I desperately wanted to follow them away from Fallingford. After that, Aunt Saskia got into her little car, shedding several scarves and a silver teaspoon in the doorway. She tried to kiss Lady Hastings and missed, or rather Lady Hastings jerked away. Then Stephen was taken away as well. Daisy and I watched out of the first-floor window, and though the monkey puzzle was the same as ever, and the gravel drive, the whole world felt different. Now Stephen was below us, being pushed into the black back seat of the police car. Daisy had her arm round my shoulder, and her most scornful expression on her face. He shouldn't have thought he'd get away with it, she said. He nearly did, I pointed out. What he was going to do to Daddy, said Daisy furiously. What he did to you. He didn't do anything to me, I said quickly. What about Bertie? Up in his room. He hasn't even been playing his ukulele, so I know it's bad. They were best friends, I said. I mean, if boys have best friends. Imagine having your best friend trick you like that. Well, I never would, said Daisy, squeezing my shoulder, and I should think you'd notice if I tried to anyway. You're far cleverer than Bertie is. I didn't feel very clever then. I didn't feel much of anything. My thoughts were all in a tangle. Stephen had nearly got away with it. We had only solved the case by the oddest, rarest chance. A few minutes more and it would have been Lord Hastings being driven away in that police car. In that moment, I wished that I had never come to Fallingford. Chapter 9. Inspector Priestley had not left with Stephen. He was still in the house, and somehow I felt very shy. I tried to keep out of his way, but it was no good. We were summoned to the library by Hetty, who looked very excited and curious, and when we arrived there were Uncle Felix, Inspector Priestley and Miss Alston, standing in a very serious semicircle. The sight made my stomach wobble. It was true. They did all know each other. I was not afraid of Miss Alston any more exactly, now that I knew who she really was and that she was not a murderer, but I had no idea how to behave around her. I was still nervous of Uncle Felix, though. He seemed so important and official that I didn't like the idea of being noticed by him, and I still couldn't guess what he was thinking. And then there was Inspector Priestley. I wondered if he was cross that we had tried to hide the fact that we suspected Lord Hastings from him. They didn't speak, and I didn't know what to say. Daisy, of course, had no such scruples. "Hello," she said, her chin going up. "Hetty told us you wanted to see us. I suppose we can spare the time. What do you want to say?" Daisy screwed in his monocle, fixing us with his eye, and then he smiled. "Daisy," he said, "you are incorrigible. Good of you to grant us an audience. Yes, we want to speak to you." I must have looked nervous because the inspector said, "Don't worry, you aren't in trouble." "Well, of course we aren't," said Daisy. "We solved the murder for you, again. I think we deserve medals." "Indeed you did," said the inspector, "and in your usual fine style. I don't doubt that we should be able to get a conviction. However, Uncle Felix put in smoothly, we need to have a word about certain other facts that you discovered, which have nothing to do with the murder." "Such as Miss Alston being a policewoman?" asked Daisy. She seemed thoroughly delighted to be able to annoy her uncle again without worrying that he might be a murderer. "Yes, Daisy," said Uncle Felix. Miss Alston shifted and coughed discreetly. "And what we must ask you now is that you do not pass on that knowledge to anyone else. It is most important that Miss Livden, which, as I think you know, is Miss Alston's real name, is able to continue working on cases such as this without being compromised." "Of course we wouldn't," said Daisy, rolling her eyes. "We're absolutely discreet, aren't we, Hazel?" "We wouldn't ever," I said, nodding as hard as I could. "I promise." "Good," said Inspector Priestley, and he smiled at me in a way that I knew meant he was really glad. I felt comforted. Miss Livden smiled at us too. Although she was still in her dull, frumpy clothes, she somehow looked less like a governess and more like a real person, and I suddenly wondered if I could be like Miss Alston some day. Of course, that was silly. Miss Alston had to be able to fit in to do her job, and wherever I go, I stand out as utterly different. All the same, I couldn't help imagining it. "Miss Livden came down to Fallingford on my orders," said Uncle Felix. "From time to time we collaborate with the Metropolitan Police." So he was M, I thought. Everything was falling into place. Miss Alston had been working for Uncle Felix. There had been something about that letter. The person who wrote it seemed to know both Miss Alston and the Wells family. We had been watching Mr. Curtis for some time. We were wise to his schemes, but we needed a few more pieces of evidence to close the case. We hoped that having a policewoman on the scene would help. Margaret had told me that her dear new friend, Mr. Curtis, was invited this weekend, and I knew I had to act. Unfortunately, he realised what Miss Livden was up to on Saturday morning. She and I were discussing whether we should bring him in when the murder happened, and then we knew that we had to keep our part in the case quiet. I suppose you thought it might mean I was guilty." I gulped uncomfortably. "Never seriously," said Daisy. "She really is a good liar. When we discovered Miss Alston's police badge, of course we understood everything." "I must admit," said Uncle Felix, "you're both very clever girls." "Give it 20 years and they'll have you out of a job," said Miss Alston, smiling at him. "Girls, it's been a pleasure to teach you, and to be suspected by you. Criminals ought to be beware." "Thank you," said Miss Daisy. "So they ought." I decided that I liked Miss Alston, or rather Miss Livden, very much indeed. We went upstairs, and as we passed Mr. Curtis's room, we saw that its door was hanging open and the windows had been thrown up. Fuzzy bluish day glowed through it and made the whole house feel lighter. The body had gone. The case of Mr. Curtis seemed to be really over at last.